Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, everyone, and hello to everyone watching online. My apologies. The baldness of my head must make it seem like I have a halo, but it's not a shine. It is the nature of my hair issues. Anyway, I'm very glad and grateful for this opportunity to chat with all of you today about the life and work of Richard John Neuhaus and about the significance of IRD to that life and work at a crucial moment, I think, in his efforts to make a case for a religiously informed approach to American public life. Let me begin, though, by just saying this. You know, the book came out in February, and since then I've done a lot of talks, been all over the place discussing his work, and I'm reliably asked two questions. The first, how does a Sri Lankan Canadian bike riding English professor and novelist from Toronto become the biography of Richard John Neuhaus? And then the second, I won a lottery. No, the second is how did he move from left to right? And I can answer both questions today, and at least one of them certainly has something to do with IRD. So as you all know, Father Newhouse died in 2009, and upon his death, he was probably America's most prominent clergyman, certainly his most prominent conservative clergyman. He was known as a public intellectual, as an inveterate signer of declarations, an activist, an author, but above all else, he was a priest, a man of God who took his vocation to public life seriously from that first principle, and it's kind of informed everything else he did. After he died, I wrote an article about him for The Walrus, which is a Canadian magazine, kind of like a Harper's or a New Yorker in Toronto. And basically my argument was, here's the most influential Canadian-born figure in American public life from the past 50 years that none of you have ever heard of. And I knew of him myself, and this will be how I kind of get into explaining how the book came about and then discussing it. Late 90s, I'm a cradle Catholic who grew up with a pretty straightforward devotional ethnic Catholicism, rosary beads and burying saints in the backyard to sell your house and that sort of thing. And at the same time, I had intellectual and academic interests. And by the early 2000s, or the late 90s, I was a graduate student in Boston working on a doctorate about globalization theory and the work of William Faulkner and Derrida and deconstruction. And I've got my beads and my saints. And I saw no way that these could have anything to do with each other. I was in Toronto visiting a friend whose uncle was a seminary professor. And he said, what are you working on for your dissertation? I said, I'm using globalization theory to think about Faulkner. And he said, why are you doing that? And he was underwhelmed by the idea. And then he said, here's what you should be doing. You should be reading this. And he gave me a copy of First Things magazine, which I'd never heard of. I started reading it, and what did I realize very quickly? That you could be a serious person of faith who was also cosmopolitan, cultured, interested in literature, politics, and could speak to all of that out of your first principles. Shortly thereafter, I began contributing to the magazine. I've contributed to it ever since. And over the course of that time, I became a novelist, I became an academic, and I finally had the opportunity to work on a second academic book. But the idea of doing another academic book, I mean, my first one sold in the 2 figures, if I'm not mistaken, was not exciting to me. And then I thought, the life and work of Richard John Neuhaus, which I looked at for this magazine article, was fascinating. And as a professor of American Studies, I had the chance then to kind of make this my research project with great support from my university for it, and off I went. And so for 5 years, I researched Neuhaus's life and work, and the result is this book. So you all know him, let's say, in his kind of prominence as a leading neoconservative intellectual and Catholic priest. But the life and work of Richard John Neuhaus has a very different trajectory, perhaps, than we might think. And so I thought maybe what I could do is take a few minutes and give you a sense of his full life and work. And then I'll situate specifically his work with IRD in that, and then maybe after that we can talk about his legacy and his continued relevance. He was born in 1936 in a small town in Canada called Pembroke, the 7th of 8 children to a Lutheran pastor and his wife. And he grew up then in this intensely Lutheran, small-town Canadian world. And from the earliest of possible ages, he was marked out for 2 things. He loved God and he loved making trouble. And these 2 things kind of repeatedly occurred throughout his childhood. He was a bit of a rabble-rouser with a very authoritarian father, I should add, who had such an imposing presence in this small town in Canada that his nickname was Pope Newhouse, which is a pretty ironic nickname for a Missouri Synod Lutheran, as you can imagine. By the age of 12, Newhouse was shipped off to Nebraska to a Lutheran boarding school out there. This was simply family practice. All the boys would go off to this boarding school in Nebraska, and the daughters as well. He spent 1 year there, and after a year during which he organized panty raids and beer parties, he was, I believe the term was, invited not to return. And at the same time, his parents invited him not to return home. And he was eventually sent down to Texas, where he lived in Cisco, Texas, the home of Conrad Hilton, among others. And he kind of bummed around Cisco, Texas for his teenage years. He never went to high school throughout this time, and instead was kind of, well, he was a troublemaker. I mean, his uncle, who was down there, was a World War II veteran who had returned from Germany with a treasure chest full of Nazi war memorabilia. Newhouse found it and basically just started playing with it. He cracked all these Nazi ivory-handled daggers by throwing them against the wall. He took a Nazi shotgun and was driving around the Texas Badlands shooting at rabbits all day long. Here was someone who had a lot of energy, a lot of trouble in his head he didn't know what to do with, and meanwhile at night, he kept his roommate up in this house talking about God constantly. He would worry this poor country pastor all day long with abstruse theological questions. Finally, they realized, here's someone who needs a better focus in his life. From there, he went off to a junior college called Concordia Junior College in Austin, Texas. He gets there, and the Lutheran education system, modeled in part on the German version, had kind of two tracks. You had a junior college that was part of the gymnasium system, and then a proper sort of liberal arts college. So basically, if you're in high school, you could go here. If you're in college, you would go there. Newhouse shows up day one, sees these two lines, and thinks, I don't want to go to high school. So he goes over and lines up for the college entrance. And they say, we're so sorry. We don't have a diploma for you or a transcript. And Newhouse says, well, I sincerely hope you get one someday, and just walks right in and becomes a college man. And proceeds from there into another kind of career of troublemaking and high talk, eventually finding his way to Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, the theoretical seminary of the Missouri Synod, at a remarkable time in its history. It was thriving, but it was also riven by internal conflict. And this is where we're getting perhaps a little closer now to the political ideological elements in Newhouse's life and work. So now we're talking, it's late 1950s. Newhouse is in Concordia Seminary with his very good friend Robert Louis Wilkin, who I'm sure many of you know and have read over the years. And while there, he falls under the sway of a man named Arthur C. Peepcorn, who was a theologian and seminary professor who subscribed to a small c Catholic understanding of Lutheranism, that it was a reform movement internal to the Universal Catholic Church, that Luther's Reformation was never meant to be final, and that the point of Lutheranism, according to Peepcorn, and I realize this is a minority view within larger Lutheranism, the point of Lutheranism itself was to, quote, heal the breach of the Reformation. Newhouse was quite taken with this, with the related intellectual and liturgical practices, which were in many ways, sort of small c Catholic. And he was also warring this entire time as part of a larger campus foment with other forces within Lutheranism itself that wanted to understand it in more fundamentalist terms, specifically on the question of biblical inerrancy. And there was a lot of campus debate about this, and Newhouse fully jumped into it and was seen in the 60s, in the 50s and the 60s, as being very much a man of the left, because he was interested in ecumenism. He was interested in more of a historicist approach to biblical study, that this would inform rather than undermine faith in Scripture. And by basically 1960-61, he was a leading young Lutheran on the left, with a special interest, let's say, in civil rights work. Again, open question. Is this what Two Kingdom theology calls us to, or not? To engage the world like this, or to remove yourself from it? Newhouse really clearly thought it was to engage. This led to his answering a call to go to Brooklyn in the early 1960s, where he was the pastor of St. John the Evangelist, in some ways, failing parish, or congregation, I should say, in Brooklyn. due to white flight. So in the 1950s, this historic German ethnic congregation in New York and Brooklyn basically picked up and left because of demographic changes. Black and Puerto Rican populations were increasing. They quite literally took the charter of the parish, of the congregation, and the money and left. So when Newhouse got there, there was significant financial need. He didn't even take a salary. He just basically worked nights as a hospital chaplain. And in the meantime, what did he see around? But great need, right? They were across from New York's largest and first housing project. This was a neighborhood in great distress. And what did he do? He turned it around, not on his own, but by founding a religious community that was all about urban ministry. But the key here is this: it wasn't just social programming. It was liturgy, religious community, prayer, and all of that informed social engagement all around him. And so over the course of the 60s, leading this predominantly black and Puerto Rican congregation, Newhouse became, in many ways, the leader of a thriving congregation. In turn, he became more interested in civil rights, more interested eventually in the anti-war movement, and then he hits national prominence in the mid-60s by becoming one of the leading figures in an organization called Clergy and Laity against Vietnam, against the war in Vietnam, alongside Rabbi Abraham Heschel, one of his mentors, and also the Berrigan brothers, famous from the Paul Simon song, as I'm sure you'll remember, and others. And this was the most significant religiously motivated resistance movement to the war in Vietnam, and argued basically no one can resist this war out of their religious first principles. They can only do so, or protest it, out of religious first principles. There's only the ideological opportunity until Cal-Cav came around. And this is what really catapulted Newhouse to national prominence throughout the 60s. At the same time, though, just as he was really starting to come into his own as a leading clergyman of the American left, he's writing for the New York Review of Books, he's got all the right friends, he goes to protest events with Joan Baez, she sings, he preaches, they go out for coffee later. That's all I know, everyone, to skip that one question. and on it goes, on it goes, on it goes. Yeah, that's right. Then what happens, though? There's a pebble in his shoe. Something isn't quite right. His efforts aren't fully aligning with his sense of his religious vocation and responsibilities. He tries, I think, a very ill-fated attempt to run for Congress as a radical Democrat in 1972. He comes within one vote of winning the primary, but he lost, and I think he later on realized that this was a very good thing. And this is evidence of someone kind of at odds with the world around him. He's trying every which way to figure out how to make an impact. None of it is working. 1975, this is a key moment which gets us kind of closer to the significance of IRD in all of this. 1975, 1976, two things happen. The fall of Hanoi and the Hartford Declaration. Do any of you know what the Hartford Declaration by chance? So the Hartford Declaration was, for those of you that don't, something that Newhouse put together, again leading us towards IRD in some ways. And it was a group of Protestant and a few Catholic theologians that he had brought together who all agreed that the kind of ever more pronounced turn in the Protestant mainline away from liturgy and ecclesiology towards social activism and social engagement was worrisome, because it seemed like there was a sacrifice of doctrine and belief for social impact and political relevance, let's say. And so he put together a group who signed this declaration very famously. Got him got him almost on the front cover of Time magazine, but Time compared it at the time to Luther nailing his statement against the cathedral door. It wasn't that big, obviously, but it was quite controversial. At the same time, Hanoi falls. And what happens very quickly? Reports start coming out of Vietnam of the new communist government imprisoning religious minorities. This is the key moment. So if I'm asked repeatedly, why did Newhouse go from left to right? Before I can answer, people usually just go, oh, Roe v. Wade, right? Actually, not at all. Because if we recall, in the 70s, indeed in the 80s, you could be a fully fledged member of the left and completely pro-life. This has changed, let's say, clearly changed today, but by the early 90s and the Casey moment at the Democratic National Convention, it was clear that this was no longer the case. But this was not an issue in 1973, 1974, 75. What was the issue? Newhouse in 75, 76, these reports start coming out about what's going on in Vietnam. He turns to his friends on the left and he says, they're imprisoning religious minorities. This isn't what we were about. This isn't what we protested about and were arrested for and marched against. We need to do something. We need to go down to the United Nations and sign and protest there. We need to put a statement in the Times. We've got to do something. And he couldn't find enough people to support him because, and this was his Damascus moment, I think, he realized that his allies on the left prized ideological unity and purity over their religious commitments. So religious liberty didn't matter as much as the fear of publicly criticizing a Marxist government. That was the big break for Newhouse. By the late 70s and into 1981, around then, he is becoming increasingly focused on the question of anti-communism and the soft ways that communism and Marxist theology, or liberation theology and Marxist thought, were beginning to now inform mainline Protestantism in this way and that. And then this gets us to 1981 and his involvement with, Ed Rob and Jessup, and David Jessup, among others, in founding IRD. I thought maybe, if it's of interest, I could read to you the relevant moment from the book itself to kind of situate it in his larger life. And then I'll more quickly get through the second part, and I'll take some questions, and we'll go from there. So let me just speak directly to the moment of IRD, since it's kind of self-evidently relevant. By 1981, Newhouse had found a far better focus for his interests and concerns, especially his intensifying anti-communism in what would become the Institute for Religion and Democracy. In related terms, what was his big concern? The defense and promulgation of democratic pluralism as the best possible substructure and superstructure for the defense of religious liberty, rather than Marxist dogma being used as a normative guide for Christian witness and action. And this is basically his critique of liberation theology. Relatedly, a great deal of his interest in John Paul II starts right around now in his realizing John Paul's intense reaction against communism itself and his pushback against liberation theology. Newhouse would develop this very same argument in far more significant ways in 1981 when he became a founding member of a new organization, the Washington-based Institute on Religion and Democracy. Its founding statement, which he composed, very much echoed these arguments in advocating religious freedom, politically independent churches, and pluralist democracy over and against the totalitarian structures and strictures of Marxist-Leninist thought and communist regimes. To the point that Mark just mentioned, thank God you guys transcribed it because I was able to put it in the book as a result. In remarks Newhouse gave in 2005 to mark the organization's 25th anniversary, he described IRD, quote, as one small but not insignificant Christian effort in the latter part of the 20th century to retell the American story relative to God's providential purpose and most specifically to God's creation of human beings wired for freedom. That's how we started. In more practical terms, IRD started through early 1981 discussions involving Newhouse, Methodist activist leaders Ed Robb and David Jessup, anti-communist organizer Penn Kemble, and also, if unexpectedly, Newhouse's old friend but then foe Michael Novak. So in the 70s, Novak and Newhouse sniped at each other in columns, and it got pretty ugly. And eventually, they just broke with each other. And then George Weigel, seeing that there was a larger enemy to consider than each other, brought them together over bad pizza one night in Seattle. And then they became involved in lots of different things, not least IRD. The IRD's founders were convinced that the national leadership of major American churches, namely the United Methodists, the Episcopalians, and the Presbyterians, and their associated organization, the National Council of Churches, were enabling the spread of communist doctrine, and with it the suppression of religious freedom, democracy, and Christianity itself, by using their various outreach offices to send aid to left-wing social and educational programs in Soviet bloc countries. Now this became a matter of national controversy, as I'm sure many of you remember, when 60 Minutes decided to run a program right around now called Do You Know Where Your Church's Money Is Going?, hosted by Morley Safer, for which Newhouse was interviewed, as was David Jessup. And this was a big deal. When it happened, it led to Newhouse losing basically his then job with CREA, the Carnegie-related organization that he'd been part of at that point. And it leads soon thereafter to his work on The Naked Public Square, his most important book about religion and public life, and his life thereafter. I thought I would just quote one more thing. After that 60-minute show aired, the NCC, the National Council of Churches, filed formal complaints with 60 Minutes over the story, outraged by what they regarded as unjust and inaccurate depictions of their activities, and mindful of how devastating such reports would be to their levels of support in Cold War-era America. The NCC also knew that the IRD was the principal player behind this double takedown, and this is what one NCC spokesman told the New York Times, quote, "They have set out to do us in, and they must be taken seriously." So that was the NCC on the IRD. One example maybe where you would like to quote the New York Times in your favor, perhaps. Anyway, so following that, the second half of Newhouse's story is one that I'm sure many of you know, perhaps in more developed terms. 1984, he becomes really the figure that he would stay as for the rest of his career because of The Naked Public Square. He was not making fresh arguments there, I need to say. These were arguments he'd been making about the necessary place of religion in American public life since the 60s, turning on his signal point, which is the question isn't whether religion should be involved in public life. The question is how should it be involved? But 84, what do we have? We have Reagan's re-election, Mondale, and the moral majority. It was kind of a perfect storm. And what does Newhouse have but a punchy title, right? The Naked Public Square. It's an easy way to explain what he was talking about. What's not remembered, though, is that Newhouse's critique was not only of secular progressivists who would have nothing to do with religion in public life. It was matched by his deep and sharp critique of the moral majority for having no publicly available account for why religion should matter in public life. Theirs was only, as it were, an account from belief. Because you believe like we do, you should behave this way in public life. And so what Newhouse was basically saying was a plague on both of your houses. Neither of these is helpful, productive, salutary to a thriving American public life. We need to find a publicly available language that demonstrates the significance of a religiously informed approach to the great questions of our day. This becomes his life and work thereafter. He makes national news a couple of different times, one for being fired from his day job by the Rockford Institute, about which more I could say. He, in 1990, realizes that the Lutheranism he had subscribed to, this idea of a kind of confession that's moving towards healing that breach of the Reformation, really was a significant minority view, that Lutheranism had become another Protestant denomination rather than small c Catholic, and so he converted to Catholicism, became a priest a year later, founds First Things magazine, and then the rest of the story just kind of goes from there. Many books, many conversions, many religious vocations, all discerned either through direct contact with him or through the kind of community he created. He comes into perhaps his most controversial presence in the early 2000s when it becomes clear that he has had an important role to play in identifying ways in which the Bush presidential campaigns could derive support from conservative Catholic voters. And that becomes, in some ways, how he is later, and I think unjustly, kind of painted as a Republican with a Roman collar, basically. You know, in the end, I think Father Newhouse's life and work attest to someone who always took his first call the most seriously, which is his call as a man of God. And for all that we talk about, all of this political material, throughout his life, he was also a pastor and a priest. And by the end of his life, here's somebody, you know, who is lunching with popes and presidents on a regular basis, but he was also just the associate pastor of a Filipino parish down the street from his place in New York. And I went there many times to interview various people, and the beauty of it was they knew, oh yeah, he was a TV priest, he used to do that magazine stuff, right? But they didn't think of him that way. They understood him, for all that we understand him as Father Newhouse, fearsome Father Newhouse on Sunday morning on the talk shows. For them, he was Father Newhouse Sunday morning at the altar. And I think remembering both of those things, and in a place like IRD, it's not hard for me to make this case, I think most fully attests to the life and work of Father Richard John Neuhaus. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Randy. Any questions for Randy? Yes. Joseph, do we need to pass the microphone? Randy, how do you account for Richard's, was it just native brilliance? You know, you just described his education, no high school, apparently junior college, and then seminary.
Yeah.
And yet, Richard, and I've been reading First Things since the first issue, his ability to critique philosophers and theologians and write about literature, and that in the back of the magazine, The Public Square, his breadth of knowledge was really encyclopedic. And so for a man who did not get a doctorate in theology or from a major Ivy League institution, it was really quite remarkable, his breadth of what he read, what he wrote. I mean, he wrote, you know, so much. He was self-taught. So how do you explain that, other than just giving me an answer saying, well, he was a genius?
Well, I think you're right about that sense of native brilliance. I would point out two things. One, from the earliest possible age, he was a voracious reader. And so all the people that he grew up with would remember the following. They would be all outside small town Canada playing hockey, playing in the snow, and he had this attic in the pasturage, and he would just be up there reading, constantly reading from the earliest possible age. So he had an openness that way, but it wasn't just that. He had a confidence in his own capacity, and I'll give you two examples of this. One, when Clem Newhouse had to go off to conferences or go fill in at another church or something, on Saturday mornings in small town Canada, he would ask his son Richard to teach the confirmation class to people many years older than he was. He wasn't himself even confirmed yet, but he would go in and teach them the catechism, and nobody questioned this. It all made sense. And then the one other one from that period, he was in class one day, small town Canada, in class, and I guess this would have been junior high, and the teacher was explaining some lesson, and Newhouse put his hand up and said, "You're wrong." And the teacher sarcastically says, "Well, do you want to come up here and teach the class?" And he said, "Yes." And he got up and went up and began teaching the class. And the teacher went and sat down in a seat and just sat there with the rest of them while he taught. So it's that confidence and the fact that he could back it up. Final thing I would just say is the most depressing moment I had as a biographer was I'd spent months going through his personal papers. I mean, he didn't have an inconsiderable ego. So he printed every email he ever wrote. And for my sins, I went through every single one of them. And my fingers were peeling at this point because of how much time I'd spent doing this. All done. Then I go back to the apartment, his apartment in Manhattan. And in the basement are cases and cases of detailed notes he took on his reading in the 60s and 70s. Hundreds upon hundreds of pages of just, he's read something and he's thinking out loud about it, right? It was so depressing. And then I just decided that, it's just too late. You know, it's in the basement. I don't have time. I don't know. It's moldy. I don't want to go down there. I decided not to go into it. But what I realized was not only was he brilliant, but he was just hungry for it. And he couldn't stop himself. So he's doing it this way. He's doing it from the pulpit. He's doing it in the back page. There's just a voraciousness there that I don't think was ever quenched. That's, I think, how I would account for it. A question over here? Yes, sir.
There was something you said that surprised me. You were telling the story about how you moved from liberalism to conservatism, and I expected you to say that the Naked Public Square was sort of the fruit of his conservatism, but then you didn't say that. You said that actually some of those ideas actually go back to when he was a liberal. Mm-hmm. You kind of briefly went over that. I mean, you went over it kind of quickly, so could you expand upon that? Sure. How's that related to his liberal?
Well, look, in the epigraph to the book is the following. We have to see that the priest as priest is a public person, that he is a political person. Richard John Neuhaus said this in 1967, right? It wouldn't surprise us if he said this in 1997, in 2007. But he had, this kind of speaks to his insistence, a little, I don't entirely buy it, but throughout his whole life, that he never changed left to right, that the culture changed. But the point, I guess, would be if Newhouse believed that religious people, religiously serious ideas, had a part to play in the larger American story. In the 60s, few people would disagree with this on the left. You know, and I'd go back to the Berrigan brothers, to as he always reminded us, Dr. Martin Luther King, the Baptist minister, not just the activist, right? That same idea carried through, but his focus the way that he drew evidence for why religion has to stay part of this, I think came more and more from a conservative side as the American left became ever more kind of closed in its secular progressivism. But I would say there is a pretty strong continuity there. Just the evidence that he began to cite changed. That's where I would see a continuity. His anti-communism would also be, I think, probably an important element here. Again, it could be, as we know back from even the partisan review days and the early neoconservatives, you could be a very strong left-wing anti-communist. That became very difficult by, let's say, the mid-'70s. And so, again, that's how he would have seemed, and became more conservative by the '80s. Other questions?
Did he ever express any regret for his positions on the left earlier in life? And then finally, a question I've always wondered about is, and it's not in your book, but Ernest Lefevre, whom Mike Cromedy worked for many years, recalled that Newhouse had told him once that the famous speech that Martin Luther King gave at Riverside Church, where he denounced the United States as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, Newhouse supposedly told Lefevre he wrote that phrase for that speech. Had you ever heard that before?
No, that's a new one. Okay. Now I have two reasons for the epilogue. I will say it doesn't surprise me your second point, simply because I do know for a fact that, and it's in the biography, that Newhouse referred to the Vietnamese people back then as, quote, God's instrument for bringing judgment upon the American people, or something like this. It was he was capable in spades of rhetorical flourish, right? I mean, 96, the end of democracy issue, where Newhouse openly questioned, where he gathered together a group of papers that openly questioned the legitimacy of American democracy in light of kind of the judicial supremacy is based upon decisions related to end-of-life issues. Even there, I mean, he did the dread thing, and he invoked the Nazi analogy, as he did throughout his career, I should say. So he was very capable in that sense of going, I think, in some ways too far. But really, as a result of this, he got the conversation going at a much different rate. He was very, I think, ambivalent about his life on the left, and he loved to talk about Martin Luther King. He spoke about him too much. I think he kind of overplayed the significance. I found in the research repeated similar phrases. I worked closely with Martin Luther King. Dr. King and I worked closely together. They had lunch together once, and Newhouse would have been in the room often, a room like this often enough, where King and others would have been meeting, and he would have been one of the people, let's say, who was there. But he was very, very kind of proud of that connection. And other than that, he was pretty quiet. He made a couple of sheepish references to his '72 run for Congress as a radical Democrat. But I don't think that he saw the continuities there that he wanted to emphasize.
At the beginning, you gave us a little self-disclosure about your life and how you came into this work. So you've been living with Richard John Neuhaus now for 5 years or so.
6 now, I think.
6, and you're talking about him a lot. How has the study of Richard John Neuhaus impacted your life and your practice and your theology?
Well, that's a really good question. Thank you. In some ways, it's made for some strange experiences. I'll give you one. So I am at a school in Toronto called Ryerson University. I'm a professor of American Studies there, and the school is very friendly to the work I'm doing, but I would not describe it in any ideological way as friendly to the work of Richard John Neuhaus. Really, in many ways, antagonistic. But the fact that I've been able to make a case for why he matters beyond, let's say, ideological commitments there, with support from my home institution, is evidence to me that the kind of doom and gloom view of the place of religiously serious people in American public life, or in Canadian public life, that isn't necessarily the case. That if you can, so it's made me in some ways, I guess you could say, a more confident Catholic, let's say, in a world where it wouldn't seem to make a lot of sense. The second thing is it just leads to strange things like this. When Pope Francis was elected, I had an invitation to go on TV to talk about it as part of kind of media work in Toronto. And right before I went on television, I got a call from this tiny radio station in some rural part of Canada wanting to talk about called the university and said, do you have anyone there that can talk about this new pope? I said, oh yeah, Randy's Catholic. He's doing that book about Newhouse. Put him on. And I said yes right away because I thought this is a perfect way to practice before I go on television. I don't know who Cardinal Bergoglio is, so I'm going to do my best to kind of try this out. So I get on. It's really, really kind of rushed. And this producer gets on the radio and says, okay, so who are you? And I said, my name is Randy Boyagoda, and I'm at Ryerson University. Very kind of prominent, progressive university in Canada. And so she says, and how can you talk about the new pope? And I said, oh, I'm writing the biography of a Catholic priest. She said, fantastic, great, perfect. And that was all she needed to hear. So then I go on the radio with the host, and the host says, we're here to talk about the election of a new pope with Randy Boyagoda, a Catholic priest from Ryerson University. And so I was ordained for about 5 minutes, and then I left it. But anyway, the point is, I've become far more open and about my faith commitments, and able to talk about them in ways that are religiously and intellectually serious. And that's, as an English professor, and in this day, in this world, that's not an easy thing to do, let's say. So that's been a good thing that's come of doing this book.
Anybody else?
Well, thank you very much, everybody.
Well, let's don't stop here.
Oh, Joe, okay, sure. I've got nothing to do for a little while, so please continue.
Yes, just one question.
Oh, sure.
One of my favorite memories of Richard Neuhaus was going to New Haven to the Yale Divinity School to hear him speak in the midst of in 1984, in the midst of a blizzard, and they still showed up to hear him, and I still showed up to hear him. That we were given to understand that the president of the Yale Divinity Student Association would not be available to introduce Father Newhouse, then Pastor Newhouse, because he was off in New Hampshire campaigning for Gary Hart. But it was interesting to me that Richard Newhouse was able to talk to this group and hold their attention and their sympathy. And at that time, he said, Roe v. Wade, of course, is barbarous. It is savage. And I thought the roof was going to fly off. I thought there was going to be an explosion of some kind. And they applauded him. And I was astonished at his capacity for human understanding and identification with all audiences. And this was certainly not one that was predisposed to approve of his seeming change of direction. Is there any way that, do you think it was his previous background, his youth as a radical activist of sorts? Was that what gave him his cachet with this group?
No, I don't think so. I think it was a different gift. Let me just say, now I have a third reason to write the epilogue, because that's a great story that kind of proves the point. The one question I'm often asked is legacy. What about Newhouse today? What do we miss? And the answer has a lot to do with your comment just now, in that what made Newhouse so distinctive was that he could speak well beyond his immediate ideological environment, right? So he was clearly known, we were just chatting with us before the talk, as a neoconservative, this, that, and the other. But no one would presume to limit him there, because he didn't limit himself that way. So that he would be on Meet the Press, he would be in the Times on a regular basis, right? That strikes me as part of it. And part of this is just his eloquence and his reasonableness. So that whether it's 84 there, or even in 2007, he was invited, this is the one that I mentioned in the book, he was invited to a debate sponsored by The Economist at NYU about whether religion had a part to play in American public life, whether it was positive or negative. So you can imagine the audience and their view. And at the beginning of the debate, the great majority was against it. At the end, they were for it because of Newhouse. And I interviewed Adrian Woolridge, who's the Schumpeter columnist for The Economist, who was Newhouse's partner, and he said, basically, Newhouse did it. Newhouse just was so reasonable, and that's the key, right? It isn't, you have to do this or you're going to hell. You have to do this because you believe like I do. There's something reasonable about this, right? I mean, in some ways he would point perhaps to the natural law tradition, but it doesn't have to be simply that. It's just, these ideas are inherently sound, right? And religion, they could be religiously informed, but the idea itself is reasonable. And I think once he has them there, then he can make the more eloquent account of, let's say, the horrors of abortion, and then lead to getting applause at Yale Divinity School in the mid '80s, or from an NYU audience in the 2000s. I think that's really where he was so good, and where we don't have that today. I think that's probably the great lack. One other point. He was a pastor. He was a preacher. That's the other point. He wasn't a pundit. He could be a pundit, but the fact, Davida Goldman told me this story about him going to give a book talk one night somewhere in Manhattan, and he just on the circuit gets up and talks about his new book. And for whatever reason, he just looked around as a Barnes & Noble in Midtown Manhattan. He just began preaching instead, and they listened, right? Because there's a hunger for this. This in part explains the Pope Francis phenomenon, right? There's a hunger. There's such a clear hunger for a higher order account of who we are and why we matter in this life. And I think Newhouse could make that case in a lot of different ways.
Well, just following up on that, one of the things I appreciated most about Richard was that very point, which is when I came at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, it was the rise of the New Christian Right, and people in the evangelical circles were making a mistake that Richard pointed out often, which is they were politicizing the gospel. And for all the talk we've just had here about Richard's political views, both in domestic policy, foreign policy, he always said that politics was penultimate and that theology was ultimate. And he underlined that over and over again. And that was so refreshing, being in the midst of the stirring of revival of at least evangelical Protestant political life. People would forget that theological issues were more important. And I'll never forget a story someone told me. Richard went down to Union Theological Seminary in New York City, and this was at the late 80s, at the height of Reagan's war in Central America. And Richard, in front of that audience, with a hostile question, said, you know, you are more concerned to test whether I agree with you on Reagan's policy in Central America than you are whether I believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's more important to you than what my view of the Apostles' Creed is. And he was exactly right. And they granted the point that you are making a political orthodoxy more important than a theological. And he always did that. And so I'm sure you point this out in the book, that the theological concerns were utmost to him. They were first things,
In a small sense, right? Yeah, and in all those ways, I actually begin the book partly with him at the 1994 Road to Victory Christian Coalition conference, where he came in to kind of whip up the crowd, right? Here, this is perfect, and he got up and he just chastised them and said, do you really think that a vote for the Republican Party is going to solve the problems that you see in religious terms? Put not your trust in princes. But what happened? He was given kind of endless applause for this, and he realized they weren't listening to him even. He wondered who actually heard what he actually said, right? He's chastising them, and they're applauding him for it. And this was the kind of the double challenge he had. And that's again why I'm always reminded that at the end of the day, he was a priest at Immaculate Conception, this Filipino parish in Lower Manhattan. There was that anchored him and ordered him in a different way that allowed him to kind of say to kind of remind people, no, it really is finally about God. Final point, Stanley Hauerwas. We've all heard of him, I'm sure. Good friend of Richard's over the years. They broke over 9/11. They had lots of arguments this way and that. But Stanley said to me when I interviewed him about the book, he said, Richard and I had endless disagreements that were political. And he said something like, but at the end of the day, when it came down to Jesus and Washington, I know Richard would always pick Jesus. He would just take longer than I would.
Did you write any in the book about, he wrote his last several books were on death and dying.
Yes.
And again, his reflections there
they're
are
beautiful, yeah.
unbelievably beautiful.
No, yeah, there's a lot in there about them.
And then that essay he wrote called Born Toward Dying, first sentence, which is, we are all born to die.
Yeah.
And then he just reflects on death and dying brilliantly, theologically.
Yeah. No, in some ways, those are his most lasting books. I mean, his other books about policy, they're kind of date stamped in some ways. The naked public square matters, will always matter, I think, in these discussions. But those really are the books that have some lasting effect, I think. You had a question, sir?
Let me tell you a brief story, so there is a question behind it. Okay, so I'm not making a speech. You know how people do that. I've heard two great Americans quote, is it Philippians?
I'm Catholic, so I'm not sure if you're quoting the Bible.
It's,
there. Anyway, go
it's
on.
that beautiful passage where Christ did not despise coming down, and because Christ came down to earth, he was raised up. It's a beautiful passage. Philippians 2. There you go. Richard John Neuhaus and Daniel Berrigan. And they both quoted it with power and conviction and brought tears to my eyes each time. And it never, I'd forgotten that they crossed paths in New York.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And can you talk more about their possible relationship?
Yeah,
and
sure.
So on?
Yeah, one of my regrets, I tried repeatedly to interview Father Berrigan for this, and he's just, I think, too old. I just think he's kind of, he's still alive, I think, isn't he? Yeah, but he's receded from public life, though, I think. Anyway, in the 60s, this was actually a key moment. Berrigan, Heschel, and Newhouse were the original trio that founded Clergy Against the War in Vietnam. Almost immediately after their first press conference, when they declared they were going to start this movement, John O'Connor, then Cardinal Archbishop of New York, basically directed Berrigan's Jesuit superior to send him to South America for a cool-off. Yeah, and so he was sent down. And so at the next major public event, it was Newhouse, Heschel, and an empty chair representing Berrigan to kind of point out what was going on in terms of Berrigan's absence. Berrigan comes back, and they would kind of speak one after the other. What's interesting, though, is that Francis Duplessis Gray, an old-time New Yorker writer, wrote this profile of these guys for the New Yorker magazine back in the 60s. And she was at, I think it's called the Catonsville 9 trial, one of these kind of draft card burning events. Thank you, Catonsville. And she was there, and she described everybody, everybody's getting up and giving these kind of full-bodied, intense, condemning speeches. And Berrigan was kind of among the very best in this case, but she gave it to Newhouse. At the end of the day, she said he was the most eloquent and the most fiery from the lectern. So I think they moved back and forth this way, but I suspect later in life neither was especially keen to draw attention to their connection to the other. So I didn't see a whole lot in terms of their involvement with each other. Likewise, for me, the great miss in this biography was Gary Wills. I tried repeatedly to interview Gary Wills, who famously wrote a 2005 piece for the New York Review in which he said that the danger of Newhouse is that he makes it all seem so reasonable, which is basically a working definition of Satan, from what I can tell. but he wouldn't consent to an interview. He didn't seem to be interested. But I'd be very curious. In the 60s, of course, Wills was on the right, writing for National Review. He and Newhouse have had such an interesting parallel trajectory, so I regret not getting a chance to talk to him.
I hosted a luncheon here in Washington with Wills and Newhouse.
Oh, really?
With journalists.
Huh.
And Gary was not a very friendly guy.
No.
And
Did you get the sense that they had any like they knew each other in any way?
yeah, but there was maybe a professional jealousy.
I see.
It was very cold. I sat
Yeah.
between them. And it was with journalists in the room.
Wearing a parka and a scarf, probably.
And they were just, Wills was just very icy. And it was about the role of religion in public life. And Richard was the better speaker. But Wills was just kind of
Not interested in being there.
friendly.
Yeah.
The man, Richard Newhouse, who said, who described the 60s as that slum of a decade, and the 70s as another slum of a decade, also said, do not despise your youth. It's the only youth you're going to have.
Well said.
Richard also had some enemies too, didn't he?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's putting it mildly.
Yeah.
Any of you know Herman Otten? Does that name mean anything to any of you?
Do we ever?
Okay.
Yes.
Who is he?
He is the Donald Trump of the Missouri Synod.
Yeah, that strikes me as accurate.
If you can imagine such a thing.
I'm not sure about his hairstyle, but otherwise, yeah, I think so.
He's a stormy petrel. No one is ever right or good or true. I mean,
Except
he's
He's Carl McIntyre of the.
he's a rabble rouser. He's,
Like Carl
the suits, the swells are trying to crush you and put you down.
So from the 50s onward,
Demagogue.
he was, from seminary onward, they were in seminary together, he was after Newhouse. Thought of him as a leftist, brought excommunication charges against him, heresy charges against him. I mean, he is a bit of a crank, I think. By the 90s, the way I put it in the biographies, he was almost pathologically obsessed with Newhouse, where he has this newsletter he puts out called Christian News or something like this. Yes. And there was a Newhouse watch column. Like that Newhouse was this evil, he needed to be watched constantly in terms of what he was doing. Joseph Sobran, probably someone we've all heard of in this room as well. Sobran, he was another big Newhouse critic. Wills was one. They were, he was, but that in some ways was what made him work, right? If it was only all coming from one side, and this is also why the left-right question for some reason doesn't really work for Newhouse, because in the 60s, he was being attacked for being a leftist by a guy like Herman Otten, where we would look at some of the work he was doing in the 60s and say, well, clearly he was already conservative in lots of different ways. His proto-Catholicism would strike us today as evidence of a conservative ecclesiology. Herman Otten saw it as basically evidence he was a communist. So he was always kind of attacked from all sides at once, and that's what kept him, I think, lively.
Did you, I don't know if I want this on the record. Did you deal with his pilgrimage theologically from Lutheranism to Catholicism? I'll tell you why. Anecdotally, he was on our board at Ethics and Public Policy Center, and he was in our office one day, and he had just was about to be ordained, and I went in, and my friend from Reformed Seminary will appreciate this. I was about to say, have you read R.C. Sproul's critique? I said, Richard, are you convinced now that the Catholic Church is committed to justification by faith alone? Oh, yes, Michael. Indeed it has. And then he started listing all the Lutheran Catholic dialogues and the doctrinal statements that flowed out of it. And then he said, I talked to my friend George Lindbeck about this, and I talked to my friend Wolf Pannenberg in Germany about this, and I talked to my friend Robert Wilken about this, and then I talked to, and who's the great Yale historian?
Marsden?
Pelican. I talked to Pelican about, he talked to all four of these people about justification by faith alone and where the Catholic Church was and stood now. Whereupon I didn't say, have you heard R.C. Sproul's tape on this?
Right.
I mean, he literally talked to the leading doctrinal theologians in the world, well, those were all Lutheran at the time.
Sure.
Pannenberg, Lindbeck, Wilken at the time was Lutheran. Pelican was on a journey to orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't like he had not checked the boxes to get himself, so that when ECT came along, he was not unfamiliar with what the critique might be.
Yes, absolutely. I can speak to that in a couple of different ways. The one would be, after his conversion was announced, the most significant letter he sent, this is including to family, friends, was to Lindbeck. And it went on and on and on, justifying the decision. And it struck me as both evidence of how much he... A professor of theology at, where would he have been? Yale Divinity School, thank you. Major figure in Lutheran circles, and especially Lutheran intellectual circles. And in many ways, the fact that Newhouse gave him that much, I don't think they were very close, but he gave them that much respect suggested in some ways how keen he was to make this case. That's the one thing I would point out.
You saw that
Yeah,
letter?
I quote part of it in the book. The second point I think I would make would be that Robert Wilken grew up with Newhouse, right? They've been friends since the 50s. So he has, in some ways, he's not as polite, let's say, about Newhouse in some ways, because they're basically like brothers. But he was kind of skeptical about, in some ways, the depths of Newhouse's Catholic theological formation, right? Insofar as Newhouse was basically tutored by Avery Dulles, his friend, while he was teaching at the very seminary where he was apparently being taught how to be a priest. And Newhouse had this very strange trajectory into Catholicism because, he's friends with John Paul and Joseph Ratzinger, and so it's kind of hard then to kind of think of yourself in that kind of hierarchical terms that are obviously a defining feature of Catholicism, with all kind of related doctrine. So many ways, Robert said to me that, and Robert being the very accomplished and sort of depth-charging scholar that he is, he didn't see the parallel kind of formation, let's say, in Father Newhouse when he became a Catholic. But because he was as brilliant as he was at kind of just consuming, reformulating, understanding, and rearticulating points, maybe that wouldn't have been as evident. So the only defense I would make of all that would be that he was a proto-Catholic by the 80s anyway. You know, that it was hard not to see him already moving in those terms. I will finally just say, though, that for all the evidence that, you know, like he insists in his letter of conversion that this is a kind of strictly religious question rather than a politically and culturally informed one. That makes no sense to me, right? By 1989, it seems to me like he clearly sees the Catholic Church as the kind of world's kind of indisputable singular moral authority from a kind of conservative Christian vantage. And to pretend that that didn't have a part to play in his decision to convert is absurd, especially for someone who keeps telling us that these things have a lot to do with each other. So that would be one area of the conversion that I found a little hard to make sense of. Yeah. I should just point out for time, I'm flying to Toronto tonight, so I'm in no hurry myself, but I also realize that it's a work day, so if anybody has to take off, feel free, but I'm happy to keep chatting. Okay, there we go. All right, I'll call Air Canada then and see if I can push back the flight. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. Thanks for a great presentation. This has been fascinating. But as I'm hearing you tell kind of the arc of his life, it seems to me, and tell me if this is correct, ideologically, he stayed pretty much on course the whole way through. It seems as if his changes from left to right, from Lutheran to Catholic, were more a realignment with different coalitions that he sought would better advance his ideological view. But even going left to right politically was not because his values changed. It was because he saw that he had been sold a bill of goods about the Vietnam situation, if I'm correct on that. So is that a fair assessment?
I would say yes, provided we don't put too much evidence on the ideological commitment itself. You know, I mean, I think really it was more a sense that he knew that he wanted to see American life go in certain ways, and he had ideas for it, and so he was always looking for ways in which to advance that view. I don't think that makes him an ideologue per se, but yeah, but an activist, an intellectual activist, and IRD kind of figures in this in a lot of ways because it was one of the ways that he suddenly saw an opportunity, I think, to advance, in this case, a kind of religiously serious anti-communism in the early 80s. And then the various magazines he was part of, coalitions that he joined throughout, all of that did the same until First Things. And I think First Things kind of settled it. Suddenly he had his own kind of organ platform community that he created in a lot of ways. And that became where he could kind of go further. Now, I will say, in the late 70s, if you read a book like To Empower People, which is a critique all about mediating structures and a critique of the kind of the super state as having all and total power, he's making a case in that book that same-sex parenting is a better view of how to deal with children than necessarily just giving them to a state agency. I can't imagine he'd be making that case today, let's say, right? And so he did change on some things for sure. I also suspect on certain Lutheran matters, and this would be kind of beyond my capacity to speak to authoritatively, there would have been doctrinal things there that also he would have changed on. He had a strange view of the question of obedience and authority in Catholic terms, where, as we all know, he would kind of quote the Pope authoritatively on certain things, and then when the Pope comes out very strongly against the war in Iraq, suddenly he's got this abstruse explanation for why this one doesn't count the same way, et cetera, et cetera. And meanwhile, how's this for chutzpah? Meanwhile, what did he do once? He once wrote to John Paul and explained that John Paul's very public critiques of the war in Iraq were really causing trouble for John Paul's allies in the U.S., and Newhouse was worried that John Paul wasn't getting the right views. So here's a couple of issues of First Things with some specific articles marked for you, Holy Father, that I think you should probably read, and maybe this will help you. And imagine, right, writing to the Pope and saying, you need to do a little more reading here. This is what you should be reading. But one of the few people who could do such a thing. No, I don't think so.
No, it really was the killing fields of Cambodia. He went from being a person who could write that comment about America to becoming really pro-American. And he often said, and I like this quote very much, on balance and given the options, America's a force for good in the world and not for evil. And that's just a powerful statement when those of us who work in religion, politics, dialogue, and the left just, America is the great Satan, period. Richard's ability to make distinctions between totalitarian governments, authoritarian governments, and democratic republics was just wonderfully helpful for those of us in those debates and dialogues. And the first time I met Richard, I went up to his office in New York and interviewed him for an obscure magazine that some of you have heard of called the Wittenberg Door. And I interviewed him, and he actually says in there, I said, tell us about your political pilgrimage from left to right. And he said what you said. Actually, I haven't moved, but the party has moved, and the culture's moved. I've just stayed the same. But then he said, you know, the killing fields of Cambodia and the utter massacre that occurred that we on the left said would not happen, this will not go on, has happened. And we went to our colleagues in the left and said, sign on and condemn this. And no one would sign it with him except Jim Forrest. And he was stunned. You all can't, because this will make you sound pro-American, you won't sign the statement condemning the atrocities? And he just said that it just was like an aha experience.
You know, to that point, and to your earlier point about 84 at Yale Divinity School, I begin the book, 1967, an anti-war service in Newhouse's church. The pews are full of anti-war protesters from Manhattan. There's incense everywhere, but it's not incense, it's pot. And all these conscientious objectors were proceeding up the main aisle of the church to hand in their draft cards. And Newhouse was presiding over all of this. And when it was all done, he asked them to sing America the Beautiful together. This makes no sense, right? He said it was basically like I forget how he put it. It's worth looking at. Give me one sec. But he compared it to asking Billy Graham and Bob Hope to sing communist anthems at an Honor America rally. Like, it makes no sense. Why are we singing America the Beautiful? But his point was, this is the country that we love. We shouldn't just abandon it to scoundrels. He had this, I think for him, the profound moment was he was on a stage with Norman Thomas, a longtime socialist candidate for president. And they were on the stage, anti-war rally. The crowd is full, and they're burning American flags in the crowd. And Thomas turned to Richard and said, we shouldn't be burning the flag, we should be cleansing it. And this was, again, kind of the moment for him where he realized. And the point is, he could make the case. He could get a bunch of anti-war hippies to sing America the Beautiful because he could make this case.
The first time I ever heard Newhouse speak was in 1991. It was IRD's 10th anniversary. And he was recounting, to the delight of the crowd, a meeting he had supposedly had with Pat Robertson, which he was encouraging Pat Robertson to think through more deeply a particular issue. And Pat Robertson supposedly responded, "Oh, Father Newhouse, I'm going to pray it through." And supposedly Newhouse responded, Dr. Robertson, do you always pray without thinking? And everybody enjoyed that.
Yeah,
but it seemed like he had a critique of the religious right in the 80s and 90s.
Absolutely.
But towards the end of his life, he was so closely aligned with conservative evangelicals.
Yeah, I know.
Maybe that critique was more muted. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think you'd have to decide how much overlap would there be between conservative evangelicals and then Christian fundamentalists. Let's say if they're both, as it were, Christians on the right. But in the 80s, he was sharply critical of the moral majority and saw it basically as self-defeating in its attempts to make.
Not having a natural law of public language.
Yeah, exactly. They couldn't speak in those terms. And he also, I found this interesting. This leads to ECT. In the late 80s, he received a note from Tim LaHaye. And it was Tim LaHaye had heard him speak somewhere. And it was one of these kind of rah-rah fan letters, way to kick butt, way to go, blah, 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 you get him. Can't wait to do some stuff with you. What do you want to do together? Now, Newhouse, he'd sign a coalition with my watch if he could. Like, anybody and everybody, if he saw there was common cause, he would be good to go. Not that time. He conspicuously wrote back a kind of a polite, terse letter, but did not broker any kind of interest with LaHaye. I think he saw a strong distinction there, as opposed to, let's say, someone like Mark Knoll or Colson. It is the nature of American public life today, that the distinctions between evangelicals, fundamentalists, I mean, they're all right-wing Christians, right? It's hard to see that these distinctions, in fact, do matter. But they would have mattered to Newhouse, even if in media terms, Falwell and Martin, oh, well, really, what's the difference at the end of the day, as absurd as that is. But I think he would have been keen to draw that point out.
Again, he did not like politicized religion, whether it was on the left or the right.
Yeah, and he didn't like intellectually weak religion either,
Right.
in terms of his cultural engagement, not in terms of his life as a pastor necessarily. But
Very good. Thank you, Randy.
you're welcome. My pleasure.